Okay, today we have a video on Diablo 2 Resurrected versus Path of Exile. Which game should you play? Which game is superior, and in which regards? The areas I will be assessing them on are graphics, classes, skills, items, builds and meta, endgame, currency and farming, content and updates, online offline play, and music / atmosphere. So the video in the background, I'm testing out screen capture on my new computer and thought I would just hop in and get some footage of Path of Exile, and this is one of the first areas I guess I'll address. Just with the constant updates in Path of Exile, it's not uncommon that you have a character. This character's from a hardcore league a couple years ago, and he was a pretty strong character, one of the few characters that I actually didn't die around level 90 and stopped playing. So I could not play him because of updates that have basically made the build unusable, and it took me a little bit to realize it. Apparently you cannot dual wield with skills that use only one item like you used to be able to. So I could not use my ground slam with the previous setup I had. So this aspect of Path of Exile can be kind of annoying. But alright, let's jump into this. So graphics. Diablo 2 Resurrected has far superior graphics to Path of Exile. Path of Exile previously had better graphics than the original Diablo 2. If you like 3D graphics, the art style and direction of Diablo 2 I still find holds well even today, but it was not running in a 3D engine, so there are drawbacks to that. The next area we'll be covering is classes, and Diablo 2 has 7 classes in the expansion, and Path of Exile has, let's see, 7 as well. The main difference is that in Diablo 2 the classes are distinct and unique, whereas in Path of Exile really the only difference, at least originally, was the starting point in the tree. And now with the Ascendancy classes that were added however many years ago, there are at least some differences later on in the game after you start to unlock your Ascendancy points. But even then, it's not major differences. You can still build basically any character however you want in the game. Just with the Ascendancies, they have some affinity towards certain builds. Next up, we will talk about the skills. And in Diablo 2, the skills are class specific unless you get them on items later in the game, and they are very how would you say, go with the theme of that character. So each class has, very different themes, and so they have very different skills. In Path of Exile, your skills come from skill gems, and then you modify those skill gems with support gems and and there are items that also modify those skills. So you can create a lot of very different and unique builds in Path of Exile with that level of customization, but it isn't very thematic, and so in some ways it's not as satisfying, and like in this case I ran into here, it can be somewhat annoying. And with the passive tree being so large, you can't really intuitively jump into the game, especially as a new player, and just start leveling up and assigning passives and picking skills and get through the game. Eventually you'll hit a point where you realize your build is terrible, and you will most likely just have to re-roll a character. So in Path of Exile, it's not easy to just jump in and play the game. You have to understand the mechanics, you have to understand how different skills interact with each other, and especially if you're playing in hardcore like I do, you have to understand survivability mechanics and how to avoid getting one-shotted, because that's the biggest threat in this game, is a one-shot. And that's also very annoying, because you can't avoid it in some instances. You will just be running and you won't even know what killed you, even with max resists and 6,000 life, which at the time, I don't know, I haven't played in a couple years, but at the time I was playing was a pretty large life pool. And in Diablo 2, with the way that the mechanics work, the damage is not quite as massive at times. You kind of understand, because the damage, incoming damage, is basically all the same. The only difference is how often you're hit, whereas in Path of Exile, that is not the case. You have evasion and damage reduction in multiple layers. So the way that the developers made it so that you can still die is that sometimes the incoming damage is just so large that you just get one-shotted. Next up, we'll talk about the items and the drop rates a little bit. And in Path of Exile, there is a lot of, I guess we'll also touch on currency. Pretty much you don't really find items for unique builds yourself. You get items and you sell them to other players for chaos orbs, exalted orbs, etc. And you then take those orbs and you buy the items you need from other players, unless you're playing in solo self-found, which lately, the last few times I've played, was the way that I ended up playing, just so I could avoid that, and for the added challenge. But the drop rates are just, you can't really target farm items in Path of Exile. You kind of can with the addition of the cards that they added, the divination cards. But even then, it's still not as satisfying as actually getting the item to drop. In Diablo 2, you can target items because different bosses and monsters and areas have different treasure classes, and monsters have different monster classes, so you can target items by farming certain bosses, which many players enjoy doing. because eventually, if you're with a little luck, you can get the item that you want to actually drop, and it's a very satisfying feeling. In Diablo 2, the items are worth a little more because there is not so much selling every single thing you find and turning it into currency, or picking up every item above a certain item level to sell to the vendors to convert into currency. Sometimes Path of Exile can start to feel like a farming simulator and an auction simulator, trade simulator, which I don't mind sometimes, but a lot of the time it starts to consume more of your playtime than actually playing the game. I don't know if they've added in-game trading like they've been talking about. I haven't really stayed current on the game the last couple years, but previously you had to list everything on a third-party website, and then players could look up your items and contact you in-game. Next we'll talk about the builds and the meta, which we talked about a little. So we'll hit on the meta a bit more here. Diablo 2, the meta, the game has been basically the same for 10 or 15 years now, and the meta is pretty well worked out, but even with that, people still play the game to this day, and it always feels like there's something new you could discover in it, even if you may not really be able to. There's always that feeling of discovery. In Path of Exile, it's very flavor of the month, because they will make large changes every league, with new skills being added and skills being buffed and nerfed. So people figure out what's going to be overpowered usually before the league even begins, and then everyone, or 90% of people playing in the league, will all be running the same cookie cutter build that somebody figured out and put up a YouTube video for. So that can be kind of boring at times. The end game, Diablo 2 is basically just farming different bosses for items, and you can do Uber Diablo and Uber Tristram. I've only killed Uber Diablo once, and that was when I was a teenager. I don't know when they added Uber Tristram to the game, but I have not done that. Path of Exile, the end game, is very good. I would rate the end game being better than Diablo 2, just because there's a lot more you can do, and with the map system, you do feel like there's still a lot of progression at the end of the game. So I will say that Path of Exile has a very good and unique in-game experience. Content and updates, Path of Exile gets a lot more, because Diablo 2 is a 20-year-old game, and with Resurrected it's just basically HD Diablo 2 graphic update. So Path of Exile gets major updates every 3 or 4 months. This has pros and cons to it, because it can make previous characters unplayable or unusable. It can be nice to add some freshness to the game, but if you're not current and you try and come back, you have to try and investigate and learn a lot of new systems that have been added since the last time you played. There's leagues where I'll jump in and I don't even bother with the new systems that have been added previously, because I just don't feel interested in them, and a lot of times they are more or less the same as something else that's already in the game with a minor twist to it, and it's all just, you know, different ways to farm and to get gear and to get experience. Online and offline play, Path of Exile is a online only game. Diablo 2 has online and offline play, so if you want to play offline, Diablo 2 has got more options. And lastly, the music and atmosphere of the game. Diablo 2 has some of the best music, hands down, of just about any game out there. And hearing the music today even still brings me a lot of nostalgia to when I was younger and playing it in middle school and high school with and in college with my friends and online. So after going through all these topics, in my opinion, Diablo 2 and Diablo 2 Resurrected is a much better game, but Path of Exile still has a lot to offer and has been the closest experience or game that I have had to Diablo 2, and it's a very good game in its own right. But looking forward to Diablo 2 Resurrected being released and getting to play it again on a widescreen monitor and without issues. And so that's gonna be it for this video, guys, and remember to give them the D.
It would be wrong to do that here.